4 groundskeepers had walked off the Ashworth property in 8 weeks. The last one left his tools in the driveway and didn't come back for them. The one before that left a note under the door knocker that said simply, "Not worth it." The property management company in Harwick had run out of experienced people and sent the only one left on their roster, a man named Ward Calloway, 34 years old, father of a 7-year-old girl, with a truck that needed new shock absorbers and a work ethic that was less a quality than a deeply ingrained refusal to quit. He did not know about the woman in the house. He did not know what she had lost, or what she had built before the losing, or that the gate at the edge of her property, the old cedar gate with the rusted hinges, the one her mother used to leave open for anyone who needed to come through, had been locked shut since the day Claire Ashworth came home in October and locked it herself, with a padlock she'd bought at the hardware store in town, as if keeping people out was the only thing left she could still control. He showed up anyway. He always did. If you've ever shown up for someone who wasn't ready to let you, drop in the comments. You'll understand why by the end. The Ashworth property sat at the end of a gravel road that the town of Harwick had been meaning to pave for 30 years and never gotten around to. 12 acres of maple and beech going orange and copper in October, a stone wall running along the road frontage that had started its life as a farmer's project sometime around 1890 and was losing the argument with time. A large house with gray clapboard siding, a kitchen garden that had gone to seed, a barn that hadn't seen animals in 20 years but still stood, and at the back of the property, where the land sloped gently down toward a stream, the remnants of an apple orchard that nobody had tended in a decade. The house had been Claire Ashworth's mother's, and before that her grandmother's, and before that some Ashworth whose name had gone vague in the family telling. Claire had grown up here until she was 14, when her mother's second husband relocated them to Boston, and the Harwick house became something they drove past on holidays, something that waited. Her mother had died in August. Left the property to Claire in a will that had seemed uncomplicated until Claire's aunt, Miriam Fell, filed a contest 6 weeks later from her home in Connecticut, claiming the will had been prepared under undue influence, and that the property had always been understood to be shared inheritance. The lawsuit was still in the hands of attorneys, which meant the property was in a kind of legal holding pattern. Claire couldn't sell it, couldn't encumber it, couldn't do much of anything with it. She had to prove it was a viable, functioning property rather than a burden she intended to dispose of, or Miriam's lawyers would use its disrepair as evidence to strengthen her case. This was what the property management contract was about, not because Claire wanted help, not because she had asked for it, but because her own attorney had told her plainly that documented evidence of care and improvement would weigh in her favor, and a contract with a legitimate management company constituted that evidence. She had agreed to it the way she agreed to most things now, with the minimum force necessary and no warmth at all. What had happened to Claire Ashworth in the year before she came back to Harwick was this. She had built a company from nothing, and someone she trusted had dismantled it from within. Ashworth Capital Group had been small by the standards of asset management firms, but what it lacked in size it made up for in precision. Claire had started it at 28 with $80,000, a Harvard MBA she'd paid for with loans that had taken 7 years to clear, and a reputation for being the most thorough analyst anyone had ever hired. By the time she was 35, the firm managed $400 million in client assets, had 22 employees, and had returned an average of 14% annually for 6 consecutive years. The CFO's name was Dennis Holt. She had known him since they were both 19 and working the night shift at a diner in Somerville, Massachusetts. She because her scholarship didn't cover rent, he because his family had stopped covering anything. She had trusted him the way you trusted someone you'd eaten gas station sandwiches with at 2 in the morning while studying for exams you were both terrified of failing. Completely, without the ordinary calibrations of business caution. Dennis Holt had been redirecting client funds through a series of shell accounts for 2 years before the SEC audit that found it. Claire had not known. That was the part the newspapers had been reluctant to say plainly. She had not known, because the story was neater with her as a knowing participant, which made better copy and satisfied some appetite for the powerful to be corrupt rather than merely deceived. She had cooperated fully with the investigation. She had been cleared of wrongdoing. None of that gave her back the clients who'd left, the employees who'd lost their jobs, the reputation that had taken 12 years to build and roughly 4 days to obliterate. She had come to Harwick because there was nowhere else to go, and she had locked the gate because she was done with people. Ward Calloway drove up the gravel road on a Monday morning at the start of the second week of October, his truck radio off because Pearl was asleep in the passenger seat. Pearl always fell asleep on drives over 15 minutes. She was 7 and she slept the way she did most things, completely, without reservation, folded sideways in the seat with her cheek against the window. He parked at the edge of the property where the drive widened, cut the engine, and sat for a moment assessing the visible work. Stone wall needed repointing in 3 places he could see from here. A section of fence along the south edge was listing. The gutter on the barn's east side had come down and was hanging at a 40-degree angle, which in another hard rain would pull the fascia with it. He found Pearl's school bag in the footwell of the back seat and extracted from it the small notebook she kept for drawing, tucking it on the dashboard where she'd see it when she woke. Then he got out, pulled his tool bag from the bed of the truck, and went to find whoever was supposed to brief him. No one came to the door when he knocked. He knocked again, waited, heard movement inside that was not directed toward the door, and stepped back to the porch railing and waited in the way he'd learned to wait, not impatiently, not with any performance of patience, simply occupying the moment without adding anything to it. He'd learned this from Pearl, who had taught him without meaning to that most situations resolved themselves if you stopped trying to manage them. The door opened after 4 minutes. Claire Ashworth was 41. She wore the clothes of someone who had once worn things carefully, a gray cashmere sweater that was clearly good quality and clearly had not been laundered recently, dark trousers, no shoes. Her hair was dark and pulled back without particular attention to the result. She was thin in the way people got thin when they'd stopped eating regularly, not from any intention. Her eyes were brown and direct and did the thing that certain kinds of eyes did: they assessed before they met, made their judgment before the social exchange began, so that by the time they looked at you, you were already something to them. He had the particular quality, Ward Calloway, of not being unsettled by that kind of look. He'd learned it gradually over 2 years of doing work that put him in front of people who were in some version of crisis, estates in disrepair, properties in transition, people who had engaged a handyman because something they'd owned was falling apart and they didn't know what to do about it. He showed up. He did the work. He didn't require anything from them beyond the most basic functional exchange. "Ward Calloway," he said. "Briar Property Management sent me." She looked at him for a moment in which several calculations were clearly being completed. Then she said that the agency had been told to schedule visits between 8 and noon on weekdays only, and that she expected to be notified 24 hours in advance of any work beyond general maintenance. He told her he had been notified at 9 the previous evening. She said that was not 24 hours. He didn't argue. He asked if she'd like him to come back, or to begin with the exterior maintenance items he could see from the driveway. She told him to do the work and not bother her. He said he would need to walk the full perimeter to assess priorities, and that if she could tell him which areas were of most concern, he could order accordingly. She said she didn't know which areas were of most concern. That was why she had a management company. He said he understood. He would start at the barn and work south. She said fine and closed the door. He stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the door and then at the property, and then he adjusted the strap on his work bag and went to look at the barn. Pearl woke up while he was assessing the gutter situation. He saw her through the truck's windshield, lifting her head from the window with the slightly dazed expression of a child who had been deeply elsewhere and was coming back. She looked around, found him, and waved. He held up one finger. "Give me a minute," and she settled back and found the notebook he'd left on the dashboard. The gutter was worse than he'd thought. The bracket had pulled 3 screws from the fascia, and when he got the ladder up and looked closer, the fascia itself had water damage behind it that would need to be addressed or the repair wouldn't hold. He made a note. The fence along the south edge needed not patching but replacing. A 30-foot section had rotted at the posts. Another note. The stone wall along the road was the most visible issue and the most straightforward to address. 3 sections of loose cap stones, a gap near the entry where frost heave had displaced the base course. He could set most of it without mortar, with enough flagstone from the property to do it properly. At the back of the property, where the land sloped toward the stream, he found the apple orchard. 20 trees, maybe 25, in 2 ragged rows. Unpruned for years, possibly a decade, the branches had crossed and tangled, the lower limbs dragging on the ground. But the trees were alive. He could see it in the bark, the way this year's growth had come out at the tips, the apples that had matured and fallen and were rotting in the long grass beneath. He stood at the edge of the orchard for a moment. He was not thinking about Claire Ashworth. He was thinking, in the half-absent way he thought about structural problems, that with proper pruning in late winter and a soil amendment program, these trees could produce a reasonable harvest in 2 or 3 years. A couple of them looked like heirlooms, gnarly and low-growing, the kind of cultivars that had been selected for flavor rather than shelf life. The kind you couldn't buy at a grocery store. He made a note about the orchard and moved on. Near the back of the house, tucked between a garden shed and the corner of the property, he found the gate. Cedar planks painted white once, now weathered to silver gray. Good joinery, someone had built this to last. It hung on 2 heavy iron hinges that had gone to rust, but the rust hadn't eaten through them yet. The padlock was new and bright against the old wood. Conspicuously new. The kind of new that communicated intention rather than necessity. He stood at the gate for a moment, reading it the way he read most things. Then he went back to the truck to get his notes in order because Pearl would want to hear what he'd found, and she always asked better questions than the clients did. "Was she nice?" Pearl asked when he came back and settled into the driver's seat. He thought about this honestly. "She was present," he said. "That's not the same as nice." "No," he said, "it's not." Pearl accepted this. She was still working in the notebook, a drawing of something he couldn't quite make out from the angle. "Is the house pretty?" she asked. "The property is," he said. "The house has good bones, needs attention." She nodded gravely, as if this were significant information about a person rather than a building, which in Ward's experience it usually was. He drove her to school, which was 20 minutes in the other direction, and then drove back to Harwick and started on the stone wall. He came back every weekday for the next 3 weeks. He did not see Claire Ashworth often. When he did, it was brief. She crossed the yard sometimes with a coffee mug, going from the house to the kitchen garden, where she appeared to be attempting to salvage whatever the season had left behind. She pulled dead plants. She turned soil. She did not appear to find it satisfying, but she kept doing it, which Ward recognized as a quality he respected without needing to admire openly. He noticed things, in the way he noticed things on any property, how she moved through her own space, not at ease exactly, but not defeated either. Like someone who had moved back into a house they'd once lived in and were relearning the dimensions of it. She did not treat the space as temporary, but she also did not treat it as settled. She was in between. He noticed that she was awake early. The light in the kitchen was on before he arrived at 8, and on the mornings when he glanced at the house on his way from the truck to wherever he was starting, he could see the shape of her at the kitchen table, working. On what, he didn't know. Something that required a laptop and papers and a specific posture, forward, focused, not casual. He noticed that she did not go to town. He had been in Harwick long enough to know what the town was like, small, close-knit, the kind of place where a new face was noted and an old name was noted more. The Ashworth name would have meant something in Harwick. She apparently didn't want it to mean something, not right now. The grocery delivery came on Thursdays. She did not appear to have visitors. He noticed the books on the kitchen windowsill, visible through the glass when he passed. Business books mostly, but also a few others, a novel with a library stamp, a field guide to Vermont trees that had the worn look of something used rather than displayed. He was not cataloging her. He was simply paying the kind of attention he paid to everything he worked with, which was thorough and without agenda. Properties and people both told you what they needed if you paid attention the right way. On the fourth day, she asked him how long the gutter repair would take. He told her 2 days for the gutter itself, another day for the fascia work, and that she should know the fascia damage was more significant than it had appeared from the ground. She asked how much more significant. He told her, significant enough that the water had tracked into the wall cavity behind it, and if they addressed the fascia but not the underlying damage, they'd have a mold issue before spring. She asked how much it would cost. He gave her a range. She looked at the range the way people looked at news they'd already known was coming, not surprised, just absorbing it. She said to do it. He noticed she did not flinch at the number, but she noted it. He could see it going into some internal accounting. The property was generating costs she hadn't expected, or had expected but not fully inhabited yet. He understood this. Properties had a way of making their needs known all at once someone started paying attention, like a dog that had been left alone too long and wanted everything simultaneously. On the fifth day, he was working on the fascia and she brought him a coffee. Not with warmth, not with ceremony. She came to the base of the ladder and said she had made too much and he might as well have some. He came down and took the mug and said thank you. She said the barn door was making a sound she didn't like. He said he would add it to the list. She said was the list long? He said it was organized. She nodded and went back to the house. He drank the coffee, which was good, and went back up the ladder. On the seventh day, he started on the south fence. It required posts, and he'd brought the driver from his truck, and the sound of it was loud in the quiet property, the rhythmic thud of each post going into the October ground. Pearl was with him that day because it was a professional development day at her school, one of the ones the school calendar called by a name that he suspected meant the teachers need a break. Pearl walked the fence line while he worked, inspecting each post he'd removed with the focused seriousness she brought to inspections. She had a specific way of turning things in her hands, systematic, rotating them to look at each face. That made Ward think she'd be a good engineer someday, or a doctor, or a detective. Something that required looking carefully at things other people walked past. She was doing this with a section of rotted post when the back door of the house opened and Claire Ashworth came out. She stopped on the step when she saw Pearl. Pearl looked up and saw her. They regarded each other across 20 feet of autumn grass with the mutual assessment of two people who had not been told to expect each other. Ward kept driving posts. He was watching, but he did not intervene. Pearl said in the carrying voice she used when she wasn't sure whether a situation was formal, "Are you the lady who owns the house?" Claire said yes. Pearl said, "Your fence is very rotten. Dad says it's because nobody treated the posts before they put them in the ground." There was a pause in which Claire looked at Ward and he kept his eyes on the fence line. Claire said that his assessment was probably correct. Pearl said, "We fixed a fence like this last April in Montpelier. That one had the same problem." Dad says it's a common mistake. Another pause. Claire said, "How many fences has your father fixed?" Pearl thought about this with genuine consideration. "I don't know the number," she said. "A lot. Do you have a dog? Because dogs are hard on fences. Our dog, we don't have one anymore, but when we had one, she chewed the bottom of every fence she met." Claire said she did not have a dog. Pearl said that was probably easier for the fence and went back to inspecting the post sections. Claire stood on the step for another moment and then went back inside. Ward finished the post line and started stringing the temporary bracing. By the time he was packing up for the day, the fence looked exactly as bad as it had before, only now the rotted posts were out and the work was staged for the next stage. This was the period in every repair when things looked worse than when you started, which was the hardest part for clients to live through. They expected visible progress. Progress was often invisible until it suddenly wasn't. He thought about this on the drive home, Pearl asleep against the window. Progress was often invisible. That was true of fences, and it was true of other things. He had learned this after Rebecca died, when the weeks of barely functioning had looked from the outside, and probably from the inside too, like nothing was happening. And then one morning he had made Pearl's breakfast without having to think about each step in sequence, and he had understood that the invisible work had been happening all along, under the surface. He thought about Claire Ashworth working at the kitchen table before 8 in the morning, alone in the house that had been her mother's, working at something that required her whole attention. He thought about the coffee she had brought to the base of the ladder without ceremony. He thought about the field guide to Vermont trees on the windowsill, worn from use. He thought, she is not done with the world. She just thinks she is. He drove the familiar road and let Pearl sleep and did not say this out loud to anyone. Pearl was at the property on a second Saturday in October, this time not by accident but because she had asked, and because Ward had no reason to say no, and because Pearl on a property was, in his experience, useful in ways that were hard to anticipate. She went places he didn't think to send her and noticed things he hadn't thought to look for. She found the apple orchard. He heard her calling from the back of the property, not urgently, not worried, just calling with the particular tone she used when she had found something significant, and he came around the side of the barn and found her at the edge of the untended trees, looking up into the tangle of branches with the focused attention of someone encountering a puzzle. She said, "These are apple trees, but they look sick." He said, "Not sick, neglected." She said, "What's the difference?" He said, "Sick trees are damaged at the core. Neglected trees have been left without care. They're still doing what they know how to do, growing, fruiting, they're just doing it wrong because nobody has given them direction." Pearl looked at the trees for a moment. Then she said, "Can you fix it?" He said, "With work, yes," she said. "Does the lady know?" He said, "I don't know what she knows about the orchard." Pearl said, "You should tell her." He said, "I will." She seemed satisfied and moved on to other investigations. He stood at the edge of the orchard and looked at the trees the way he looked at structural problems, without urgency, just gathering information. 20 trees, possibly 25. Alive, productive, wrong. Heirloom varieties by the look of the fruit that had come down, irregular, rough-skinned. The deep yellow-green of older cultivars selected for flavor rather than appearance. He thought, with pruning in late winter, these trees would respond. 2 or 3 years before full production, but the bones were there. He made a note. Pearl was at the property on a third Saturday in October, and she was the one who found the gate properly, found it in the way she found things, not by looking for them but by going everywhere and encountering them. She had come around the corner of the kitchen garden shed and stopped and called for him, and he came and found her standing in front of the cedar gate with her hands in her jacket pockets and her notebook under her arm. She said, "This is a very good gate." He said, "It is." She said, "Why is it locked?" He said, "I don't know." She looked at the padlock, bright and new against the weathered wood. She said, "The padlock is new, but the gate is old." He said, "Yes." She said, "Someone decided to lock it recently." He said, "Looks that way." Pearl turned this over. She was not a child who asked why without wanting to understand the answer, so when she asked things like this, she was genuinely working through it. She said, "Sometimes I don't want to let anyone into my room when I'm in the middle of something." He said, "That's true," she said, "but usually it's because I don't want people to see the mess before I've fixed it." He said nothing. She said, "Maybe that's why." He said, "Maybe." She took out her notebook and began drawing the gate. Ward stood beside her for a moment and looked at the property beyond it, the path through the back of the land, the beech trees, the stream somewhere below. Then he went back to work. Later that afternoon he mentioned the orchard to Claire. Not as a recommendation, not as a proposition, just as information. He said he had noticed the apple trees at the back of the property appeared to be heirloom varieties, and that with pruning they could be productive. She said she was aware there was an orchard. He said the trees were alive and producing fruit, even untended, which suggested they were well-established stock. She said yes. He waited to see if she had anything to add. She didn't. She was looking at a list on her phone, which was how she held her attention during conversations she didn't want to be having. He had learned to read this without taking it personally. He said he just wanted her to know, in case it was useful. She said thank you. He went back to work. She went inside. He spent the drive home that afternoon thinking about the orchard and about the way she'd said thank you and about the difference between someone who was indifferent to information and someone who was deferring it. He thought she was deferring it. She was not ready to think about futures yet. She was still in the part where you kept things at distance until you were sure you were staying. He understood that. He had been in that part himself. Pearl had fallen asleep by the time they reached the main road. He turned the radio on low and drove, and the Vermont countryside went past in its October colors, which Ward had learned to pay attention to since he'd moved here 2 years ago. The maples were at peak, a riot of color against the gray of the stone walls and the brown of the bare fields. He kept his eyes on the road and let himself be tired for the 20-minute drive because tired was allowed on the drive. That was the deal he'd made with himself. Tired was allowed in the 20-minute window between the property and home. Then home and dinner and Pearl's bath and reading and his own hour of quiet. He had been doing this for 2 years. It was still working. Pearl woke up as he pulled into their driveway. She looked around, settled herself, and said, "The gate is sad." He said, "What makes you say that?" she said. "Gates are supposed to be for going through." He parked and sat for a moment with the engine off. She got out and went inside. He followed. He parked. He got out. She told him without preamble that she had noticed he'd worked on the gate. He said he had. He said the hinges were seizing and the post joint was failing. She said she understood that and that she hadn't authorized the gate work and that the gate was to remain as it was. He said the gate would continue to damage its mounting post if it wasn't allowed to swing freely, and that by spring the whole assembly might need replacing. She said that was acceptable. He looked at her. She looked at him. It was one of those exchanges where both parties understood perfectly what was being discussed, and neither of them was referring to it directly. He said he understood, and that he would leave the gate as she preferred. She said thank you and went back inside. He stood on the drive for a moment in the October morning, the smell of cold and fallen leaves, and whatever she'd been drinking that morning, tea, he thought. Something with a slight herbal edge, and then he went to look at the fence and start stringing the new rails. He spent a large portion of that afternoon, and the afternoons of the following week, thinking about the gate and not thinking about it. He was good at this, at holding something at a distance without putting it away. He'd had to learn it after his wife died. Rebecca had died on a Tuesday in April 2 years ago on a road between Montpelier and Barre, on her way back from her sister's house where she'd gone to help with a newborn. He had been supposed to pick her up. He had gotten a flat tire 40 minutes from Montpelier, on a stretch of road with no shoulder, and by the time he got the tire changed and drove to her sister's, Rebecca was gone. The drunk driver had come through an intersection at speed, and it had happened the way those things happened in a second, in one careless increment of someone else's choice. He had been 20 minutes late. He knew, in the rational part of himself that could still do arithmetic, that 20 minutes would not have changed what happened. Rebecca would have been in the same place on the same road at the same moment regardless of whether he'd arrived when he said he would. The timing was not the thing. The drunk driver was the thing. He knew this. It did not help him at 3 in the morning. Pearl helped. Pearl was the thing that made 3 in the morning manageable, not because she fixed anything, but because she needed him to get up in the morning, and getting up in the morning was what carried him to 4 in the morning and then to 5, and eventually, without ceremony, today. He worked on the fence. He worked on the fascia. He worked on the stone wall, which took longer than expected, because 2 of the sections needed a deeper base course than he'd initially planned, and the flagstone he was pulling from the property's own margins was good material but needed sorting. On a Thursday in the 3rd week, Pearl came with him again and spent the morning making a color chart of the different maple species on the property based on their October colors. She had a system for it. She described the system to Ward in detail during the drive up the gravel road. A system that involved primary colors as base categories and then modifiers she'd invented herself, like burnt orange leaning toward red and yellow with a hint of green still in it. She took this work seriously. She always did. She was at the edge of the orchard, examining a low-hanging branch on one of the apple trees, when Ward was coming back from the barn with a piece of trim he'd removed. He stopped and watched her. She had found an apple that had stayed on the branch past the others, a small, greenish-yellow thing, dimpled and rough-skinned, nothing like the apples in grocery stores. She was turning it in the systematic way she turned things. "Is this an apple?" she called. "Yes," he said. She sniffed it. It smells different from apples. It's an older variety, probably a russet or a pippin. Heirlooms smell stronger than the commercial ones. Can I eat it? It's dropped fruit from an untended orchard. I'd wait. She put it down carefully, not dropping it but setting it on the grass, which was Pearl's distinction. She did not discard things, she placed them. Then she looked at the tree it had come from and said, "Are all these trees dead?" "No, they're neglected. There's a difference." She looked up at the tangled canopy. "Could you fix them?" He looked at the orchard. The same assessment he'd made on the first day. 20-odd trees alive, producing, just wrong. With the right work, yes. Does the lady know they could be fixed? I don't know what the lady knows about her orchard. Pearl considered this. "You should tell her," she said, and went back to her color chart. He thought about this for the rest of the afternoon. He mentioned the orchard to Claire Ashworth on a Friday, not as a recommendation, not as a proposition, just as information. He said he had noticed the apple trees at the back of the property appeared to be heirloom varieties, and that with pruning they could be productive. She said she was aware there was an orchard. He said the trees were alive and producing fruit, even untended, which suggested they were well-established stock. She said yes. He waited to see if she had anything to add. She didn't. She was looking at a list on her phone, which was how she held her attention during conversations she didn't want to be having. He had learned to read this without taking it personally. He said he just wanted her to know, in case it was useful. She said thank you. He went back to work. She went inside. He spent the drive home that afternoon thinking about the orchard, and about the way she'd said thank you, and about the difference between someone who was indifferent to information and someone who was deferring it. He thought she was deferring it. Pearl had fallen asleep again by the time they reached the main road. He turned the radio on low and drove, and the Vermont countryside went past in its October colors, which Ward had learned to pay attention to since he'd moved here 2 years ago, since the move that had followed the death, and the need to be somewhere new and still be somewhere Pearl recognized as theirs. He kept his eyes on the road and let himself be tired for 20 minutes. That was the deal he'd made with himself. Tired was allowed on the drive, and then home, and then dinner, and then Pearl's bath and reading, and then 1 hour of his own time in the quiet of the house, and then sleep and another day. He had been doing this for 2 years. It was still working. The letter arrived at the Ashworth property on the first Thursday of November. Ward didn't see it, but he heard about it, because the next morning when he arrived at 8:15, Claire Ashworth was on the porch. She had been there for a while. The mug in her hand was empty, and her posture had the particular quality of someone who had been sitting with something for hours without resolving it. She told him, without being asked, that her aunt's attorneys had submitted an accelerated motion. The probate court had set a hearing date for January. If she couldn't demonstrate that the property was being actively maintained and had a documented plan for generating income, her aunt's argument that the estate was an inherited burden rather than a functioning property would carry more weight. 90 days, she said. Ward listened. She said she was telling him this because it affected the timeline of the work. She needed the most visible improvements completed before January, and she needed documentation of the work, receipts, contracts, photographs. He said he understood and that he could provide all of that. She looked at him then, directly, in the way she rarely looked at him directly. He had the impression she was deciding whether to say something more and then deciding against it. He asked if there was anything else he should know that would affect the work. She said no. He went to start on the window trim, which was the next item on the list, and didn't push. What had happened to Claire Ashworth, in the specific interior way things happen that don't show up in SEC filings or newspaper stories, was this. She had believed that the thing she'd built was proof of something. Not wealth, not exactly. Proof of a more particular kind. She had grown up in a family where money was always the distance between where they were and where they needed to be. Her father had worked 2 jobs and still couldn't cover the oil bill one January. She remembered the cold, the particular cold of a house that was heated room by room, the cold that told you exactly where the edges of the family's reach stopped. She had climbed out of that cold with her own hands, loan by loan, credential by credential, client by client. She had believed, somewhere underneath the rational surface of her, that having built the firm was the answer to the question her childhood had asked. The question being, is this what you are or is this what you have? When the firm collapsed, the answer landed with the force of a verdict. It had always been what she had, and now it was gone. Dennis Holt had taken it. Dennis, who had sat across from her in the diner in Somerville at 2 in the morning, cramming for exams they were both terrified of failing. Dennis, who had called her when his mother was dying and she had gotten in her car and driven to Providence without a second thought. Dennis, who had been her CFO for 9 years and her friend for 20, and had apparently been stealing from her clients for 2 of those years, with a methodical, unhurried patience that she still could not make sense of. She had trusted him the way she trusted her own hands. Completely and without verification, which was the kind of trust that only existed where there had never been a reason to doubt. She had been wrong. She was not, at 41, a person who allowed herself to be wrong for long without addressing it. She was analytical, systematic, capable of absorbing bad information and recalibrating. This was one of the things that had made her good at what she did, but this was different. This was a wrong she could not recalibrate around, because it wasn't the fraud that kept waking her up at 3 in the morning. It was the truth that the fraud had uncovered, that she had known Dennis for 20 years and understood him far less well than she'd believed, that the evidence of his character had always been available and she simply hadn't been looking for it because she hadn't thought she needed to. That certainty, the certainty that you know a person, was not something you earned. It was just a feeling. A feeling that could be wrong. She had come back to Harwick because this was the place her mother had known her before she was anything other than a child in the family's house. Her mother had died without knowing what had happened to the firm, which was the one merciful timing in the entire disaster. And now the house was here, which was the last true thing Claire still held, and Miriam was trying to take it. Miriam, who had not spoken to her mother in 8 years over a matter of inheritance from their own parents that Miriam claimed had been mishandled. Miriam, who had sent one card when Claire's mother was dying and not attended the funeral. Miriam, who was now using a lawsuit to reach into the one place that was still intact. She was not going to let the house go. She did not know yet what she was going to do instead. But the house was not going anywhere. The setback came in the 3rd week of November. Ward arrived on a Tuesday morning and found a message on his phone from Breyer Property Management, left the evening before, informing him that his assignment at the Ashworth property was being terminated, effective immediately. The message was from Greta Hollies, who ran Breyer's field coordination, and it was business plain. The client had submitted a complaint regarding unauthorized work on a gate structure. The agency was not in a position to continue the assignment under those circumstances, and his hours through the previous Friday would be processed in the next pay period. He sat in his truck at the edge of the gravel road for a while. Pearl was at school. He had 2 hours before he was supposed to be anywhere. He sat with it. He had fixed the gate. He had fixed it and then been told not to have done so, and he had accepted that, and then the complaint had gone in anyway. He was not angry about this exactly. He was clear-eyed about what it meant. She had complained because she needed to establish control over a situation that felt uncontrolled, and the gate was the most available symbol of that. The gate and the complaint were not really about him. He also knew that the fence work wasn't finished, that there was a 20-foot section still needing rails, and that the property had an upcoming court hearing, and that Greta Hollies' message did not mention any replacement being scheduled. He also knew that Pearl had left her jacket at the property 3 days ago. The green jacket with the reflective strip that Pearl was clear-eyed about the importance of. It was the warmest jacket she owned, and it was November. He sat with all of this for 20 minutes. Then he started the truck. He drove up the gravel road. He parked in the usual spot. He got out, pulled his tool bag from the bed, and went to finish the fence rails. He was 40 minutes into the work when Claire Ashworth came out of the back door. She stopped at the edge of the porch. He kept working. She said, with the particular precision she used when she was being exact rather than polite, that she was under the impression that Breyer Property Management had ended his assignment. He said they had. She asked why he was still here. He said the fence wasn't done. He said Pearl had left her jacket at the property and he needed to collect it. And he said that he'd thought about it on the way up the road, and that if she didn't want him here, he would leave when the fence rail was set and the jacket was found, and he wouldn't come back. She stood on the porch. The November morning was cold enough that her breath was visible. She said after a moment that she was the one who had complained. He said he knew. She said she had done it because he had worked on something she had specifically said to leave. He said he understood. She said she wanted to know why he'd done it. He set down the rail he was holding. He turned and looked at her. He said, because the gate was going to damage its mounting post if it wasn't addressed. Because good joinery should be maintained when it can be. Because someone built that gate to last, and it was still capable of lasting, and it seemed wrong to let it fail for want of 20 minutes of work. He said he was not trying to make a point about the padlock. He was trying to do the work the right way. She stood on the porch and the morning was cold and the maples had gone bare and the stone wall caught the November light the way stone caught light, flat and gray and permanent. She asked him what he charged per week all in. He told her. She said she would hire him directly. She said she wanted a written agreement, she wanted detailed records, she wanted photographs of every completed item. She said she needed this to be professional and documented and not casual because the documentation mattered for reasons he already knew about. He said he could do all of that. She said good. He said he'd draft something by Thursday. She asked what was in the barn. He said he hadn't been inside the barn yet, that it had been locked. She said she would leave it unlocked and he could assess it this week. He said all right. She went back inside. He set the fence rail and thought about the gate standing there at the edge of the property with its padlock, and about Claire Ashworth deciding to keep him on anyway, and about the things people kept locked and the reasons they kept them. Then he found Pearl's jacket hanging on a hook inside the kitchen garden shed, and he left it on the passenger seat of his truck to bring home, and went back to work. December came in cold and definite. Pearl came with him on Saturdays, when he was doing the work that required a full day rather than half one, and over the course of 3 Saturdays she had made herself at home on the property in the way that 7-year-olds made themselves at home anywhere they were allowed to exist without being managed. She explored. She documented. She brought her notebooks and filled them with observations that were partly scientific and partly something that didn't have a name yet. The drawings of gates and stone walls and bare maple branches that were organized in ways that made sense to Pearl and would have made sense to Rebecca, who had been a visual thinker in the same particular way. Ward thought about Rebecca on the property. Not constantly, not painfully, just the occasional surfacing of her, the way she would have looked at this landscape, what she would have said about the stone walls. She had liked old things that were still working. She had been good at finding them. Pearl and Claire Ashworth had developed something that did not have a category Ward could easily name. It was not a friendship. Claire was not someone who made friends in any ordinary sense of the word. But Pearl was not looking for a friend exactly. Pearl was looking, in the way she always looked, for things that were interesting. And Claire Ashworth, whatever she was interesting. The specific thing that started it was the kitchen garden. Pearl had found Claire pulling dead tomato plants one Saturday afternoon in late November and had gone over to assist without being invited. The assistance took the form of Pearl asking, in rapid succession, why they had to come out now rather than in spring, and what happened to the roots, and whether the soil would remember having had tomatoes in it, and whether you could grow tomatoes in the winter inside a window if you had a very sunny window. Claire had answered each of these questions. Ward watched from across the garden, where he was working on the greenhouse glazing. He watched Claire answer with the patient specificity of someone who found the questions legitimately interesting rather than tiresome. He thought. She had not learned to be indifferent to children. She had just not been around them. By the second Saturday, Pearl had opinions about which section of the kitchen garden should be turned first, based on what she described as the angle of where the sun goes. The logic was coherent. Claire had listened to it and then confirmed that Pearl was right about the angle of the sun, and that was where she had been planning to start anyway. Pearl had accepted this with her characteristic measured satisfaction, not smug, just settled, the way she accepted things that confirmed her reasoning. On the third Saturday, Pearl asked Claire why she kept the gate locked. Ward heard it from 20 feet away. He kept his eyes on the greenhouse glazing. He did not intervene. There was a pause. Not a long one. Claire said that she preferred the property to be private. Pearl said that gates were usually for going through, not just for looking at. Claire said that was one way to look at it. Pearl said, with the precise literalness she brought to things she was still working out. Our neighbor, Mrs. Pellerin, had a gate, and she said it was for knowing when someone was coming, not for keeping people out. She said you could always see them coming through a gate. Another pause. Claire said that was a reasonable use for a gate. Pearl said, do you want to be able to see people coming, or do you want to keep them out? Ward finished what he was doing on the glazing and turned at this point to look. Claire was looking at Pearl with an expression that was not quite what he'd seen from her before. It was something in between, something that had been found out without anyone intending it. Pearl was not looking at Claire with any particular weight. She was just waiting for the answer. Claire said after a moment that she was still working that out. Pearl accepted this. She nodded the small, decisive nod she used when something was unfinished but accounted for. Okay, she said, and went back to the kitchen garden. Ward did not say anything to Claire about this exchange. He finished the glazing, packed his tools, called Pearl to the truck. Claire was on the porch when they left, her hands around a mug, watching them go. She raised one hand as they drove out. Pearl waved back. He drove the gravel road and let the silence hold. He thought about Rebecca, who had been good at those questions. Not the obvious questions, the sideways ones, the ones that found the thing underneath the thing. He thought Pearl had inherited this. He thought it was one of the best things she'd gotten. He thought about the gate. The weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas were busy in the way property maintenance was always busy before winter settled in. The last of the exterior work before the ground froze hard, the glazing, the weather stripping, the barn interior that had turned out to contain 30 years of accumulated equipment and needed to be assessed and organized before the space could serve any purpose at all. Ward had been in the barn for 3 full days by mid-December, cataloging what was there, and what he'd found was interesting in the specific way that old farms were interesting to someone who thought in terms of systems. There was equipment for sugar maple production, old taps, collection buckets, a small evaporator with a wood-fired firebox that was primitive but functional. There was a cider press. There was a root cellar off the east side of the barn that had been built with the care of someone who understood cold storage, with a slate floor and thick stone walls that would hold temperature well. He mentioned the sugar equipment to Claire on a Wednesday afternoon when she came to the barn door to ask about a bracket he'd requested from the hardware store. He said, "There's a small maple sugar works in here. Not large scale, but functional. 3 or 4 taps per tree would give you 20 to 30 gallons of syrup per season from the trees you have on the property." She looked at him. Then she looked past him into the barn. She said, "That equipment is very old," he said. "The evaporator needs a new firebox door and the collection system could be modernized cheaply. The press is in better shape than the sugar works. The wooden screw and the platform are sound." She said, "Cider." He said, "Heritage apples like those in the orchard would make excellent hard cider. There's a market for it. It's grown substantially in the last decade, particularly for orchard-specific ciders." She looked at him for a moment. The assessment look, the one she used when she was deciding whether information was trustworthy. She said, "Why do you know about hard cider markets?" He said, "I follow agricultural systems. It's a habit." She said, "You're a groundskeeper who follows agricultural systems." He said, "I was a structural engineer for 6 years. I changed careers when my wife died. I follow a lot of things out of habit." This was the most he had said about himself in her presence, and he said it the way he said most things, not for effect, just as information. He was watching her face and he could see her absorbing it. She said, "Why did you change careers?" He said, "Pearl needed someone who was home by 4 o'clock." She said nothing for a moment. She said, eventually, "I see." He said, "The estate has viable assets. The orchard, the sugar bush, the press, the root cellar. If those were functioning and documented, it would matter for the court hearing." She said, I am aware that the estate has viable assets. He said, I thought it might help to hear someone say it plainly. She looked at him for another moment and then she said something that surprised him. She said, come inside. I want to show you something. He followed her into the house. She had been working. He could see it, the kitchen table covered in papers, a laptop open to something spreadsheet-like, notebooks with handwriting that was small and dense. She was not idle in that house. Whatever she was doing during the days he was working outside, she was doing it at this table. She showed him a document she had been building, an asset inventory, handwritten first and then transferred to a spreadsheet. She had been moving through the property systematically in a way that ran parallel to his own assessment, which meant they had been doing the same work from different angles for weeks without knowing it. Her document was thorough, but it had gaps in the sections about the agricultural equipment and the orchard, because she didn't know what questions to ask about those systems. He looked at her document for several minutes. He pulled a chair out and sat, which he hadn't done before, had always stood in the kitchen on the brief occasions he'd been in it. She didn't say anything about him sitting. He asked questions. She answered them. What were the maple stand boundaries? She didn't know precisely. He said he could map them by late December if the snow held off. She said all right. What was the condition of the taps, the old ones in the barn? He said usable, but he'd want to replace the spouts. She said she'd price them. He said he knew a supplier in Maurysville. She said she'd take the contact. They worked through the spreadsheet for an hour. Outside, the December afternoon went gray and then dark, the early dark of Vermont in mid-December that arrived before people were ready for it. At some point he realized that Pearl was no longer in the sitting room, and then he heard her in the hallway, and then she appeared in the kitchen doorway. She said, I'm hungry, he said. We're heading home soon, she said. Okay. She looked at the table, at the papers and the laptop and the two people sitting across from each other working through something. She looked at this with the systematic attention she gave to new configurations of people. Then she went back down the hallway. He heard the soft thud of her settling onto the sitting room floor, which was what she did when she decided to wait somewhere. Claire said, quietly, without looking up from the spreadsheet, she's patient. He said, she's been training me for patience for 7 years. Something moved at the corner of Claire's mouth. Not a smile exactly, more the shadow of one, the shape your face made when something landed before you were ready for it. He looked back at the spreadsheet. He said, if I drew up a use plan for the agricultural assets, specifically the sugar bush, the orchard, and the cider operation, could you present it to the court as evidence of a documented income strategy? She said, yes. If it's credible, he said, it's credible, I can make it credible. She looked at the spreadsheet and then at him. She said, I don't understand why you're doing this, he said. The work is interesting and the property should be maintained. She said, that's not an answer to what I asked. He looked at her directly. He said, I know. She looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Pearl appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding a folded piece of paper. She had been in the sitting room with her notebook for the past hour, which meant she had produced something and was ready to present it. She said, I drew the gate. Claire said, let me see. Pearl brought the drawing to the table. It was the cedar gate from the back of the property, rendered in Pearl's systematic way, architecturally precise for a 7-year-old, every plank counted, the hinges properly placed, the padlock shown as a small square in the lower corner. And through the gate in the drawing there was a figure, not two figures, one figure walking through. Claire looked at the drawing for a long moment, then she looked at Pearl, then she looked at Ward. She said to Pearl quietly, who is that? Pearl said, I don't know yet. I was drawing the gate first. The room held that. Ward looked at the drawing and thought about Rebecca, who had never seen this gate but would have understood the drawing instantly. He thought about Pearl, who had produced the thing without intending it to be what it was. He thought about Claire Ashworth, who was looking at it with an expression that finally, for the first time in 6 weeks, he could not read. He said to neither of them in particular, I'll start on the use plan this week. Pearl said, can I keep working on the drawing? Claire said, yes. Ward said, we should head home. Pearl said, not yet. They stayed another hour. Claire made tea. Not offered, just made. Ward heard the kettle. And then she brought 2 mugs to the table and a cup of warm apple juice for Pearl without discussion, without ceremony. Pearl accepted the juice with the matter-of-fact gratitude she applied to things that arrived when she hadn't asked for them. They stayed long enough for the December dark to settle fully and for Pearl to finish the revision she was making to the gate drawing, which involved adding leaves to the beech trees visible behind it, and for the tea to go cold, which was when Ward looked at the time and said they needed to go. Pearl left the drawing on the table, not forgot, left. There was a difference, which was the difference between Pearl and most children. Claire said, "I'll put it somewhere safe." Pearl said, "Okay." She found her coat in her backpack and said goodbye to Claire with the directness she applied to hellos and goodbyes, which was to look at the person and say the word and mean it, no performance around it. Claire said, "Goodbye, Pearl." Pearl said, "See you Saturday." It was not a question. Ward looked at Claire over Pearl's head. Claire looked back. Then they both looked away. He drove home in the December dark with Pearl narrating the drive from the back seat in the particular way she narrated drives home. Not about what she'd done, but about what she'd noticed. The color of the last light on the maples. A barn with an unusual roof pitch. A brook he'd driven over that she thought they should explore sometime. He listened. He said yes, sometime, to the brook. He thought about the drawing on the kitchen table and about the figure Pearl had put walking through the gate and about the fact that Pearl had said she didn't know yet who it was. He thought. She knew. She was just being kind about it. The use plan took 3 weeks to build properly. He worked on it at the kitchen table in the evenings after Pearl was asleep, and he brought to it the same systematic attention he'd brought to structural calculations years before: load tolerances, material specifications, failure points. The language was different. The method was the same. He checked his numbers 3 times, cross-referenced the agricultural data with 2 other operations of comparable scale, and wrote it in the plain language he'd learned to use when presenting engineering findings to clients who were not engineers. He brought it to the Ashworth kitchen on a Wednesday evening in early January, because that was when Claire was there and would be there for a while the evenings, when the day's work was done and the table was clear, and she was at her laptop with a focused stillness that had, over the past 2 months, replaced some of the rigidity of October. She was still contained, still armored in certain ways, but the containment had shifted from defensive to something more like concentration, which was different. The hearing before the probate court was set for the 3rd week of January. Ward spent 3 weeks building the agricultural use plan. He had not been asked to do this as part of any contract. He built it because it was the kind of problem his mind went toward naturally, the intersection of systems thinking and physical assets and realistic numbers. He drew on his engineering training for the structural assessments, and on 2 years of working Vermont properties for the agricultural knowledge, and on things he had simply read because he paid attention. The plan covered 3 streams of documented, realistic income: maple syrup production from the property's 40-plus identified maples, timed to the season beginning in February with production in March and April; heirloom cider production from the apple orchard beginning with the following autumn's harvest once pruning was completed this winter; and a kitchen garden market stall or subscription operation using the south-facing plot Claire had already begun working. He included photographs. He included equipment assessments. He included comparative data from other small Vermont estates that operated similar operations. He included a 10-year projection that was conservative and footnoted. He brought it to the kitchen table in early January, one evening, because that was when Claire was there the evenings, when the day's other work was done, and she was at the table with her laptop and her notebooks. She read it for 45 minutes without speaking. Pearl had fallen asleep in the sitting room. Ward could hear her breathing from where he sat at the table, the deep rhythmic breathing of a child who slept completely with her whole body. He waited. He had learned to wait. It was one of the things that working properties had taught him and raising Pearl had confirmed, and 2 years of getting up every morning and doing the next thing had built into a practice. The thing that needed doing would become clear if you didn't rush toward it. Claire read. She turned pages. She went back twice to sections she'd passed, which meant the numbers were interesting to her, or something in the numbers had raised a question, Or she was simply being the kind of reader who didn't accept information the first time without checking it against itself. He watched her face while she read, not intrusively, just the occasional glance. She was the kind of reader who showed nothing while she was working, and everything when she came up for air. When she set the document down, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. He had seen this gesture before. It was the gesture she used when she was not performing composure but genuinely holding herself steady, the way you placed your hands flat when you needed the surface under them. She said, "This is very thorough." He said he'd tried to be accurate. She said, "You were an engineer for 6 years." He said, "Structural, commercial, and residential." She said, "And you left to do groundskeeping." He said, "To raise Pearl." She said, "You could have kept the engineering career and had childcare." He said, "I could have. But I'd watched what it looked like when someone prioritized the career at cost to the child, and I didn't want to do that." She said, "Was that Rebecca?" He said, "No. It was me, actually, before she died." She looked at him. He said, "I worked 60-hour weeks for 6 years. Pearl was 2 when Rebecca died. I was not in that house the way I should have been. I don't know if it would have made a difference. But I know I want to be in the house now," she said, "and the engineering knowledge stayed." He said, "Knowledge doesn't leave, it just waits." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the plan. He thought she was deciding whether to say something and then deciding to say it. She said, "I keep reading this and thinking about what my mother would say. She used to walk the property every evening, the whole circuit. Orchard, stone wall, back to the house. She knew every tree." He waited. She said, "She never made it profitable. That wasn't what it was to her, but she kept it going. Kept the barn in order, kept the garden producing, kept the maple trees tapped every year even when it was just for syrup she gave away to neighbors. She considered that a kind of tending that was worth doing for its own sake." He said, "It is." She looked at him. She said, "You sound like her." He said, "I'll take that." A small silence. She looked at the plan again. She said, "If I pursue all 3 of these streams, it's not cosmetic, it's real work, real income. It changes what the property is." He said, "Yes." She said, "I would need help." He said, "Yes." She said, "I can't pay you what an engineer makes." He said, "I know what the work pays. I accepted it when I took the contract." She looked at him steadily. She said, "Why are you still here?" He said, "I keep asking myself the same question." She said, "And?" He said, "I think it's because the property is worth saving. And I think it's because Pearl asks better questions on the drive home than I'd expected. And I think it's because you're not actually indifferent to any of this, even though you've been trying to look like you are." She was very still. He said, "I think the gate has been locked because you didn't know whether you were staying or going. And I think you've decided you're staying, and you just haven't figured out how to make the gate mean something different." She sat with that for a moment. She said, "You've been watching me." He said, "I've been paying attention. There's a difference." She looked at him. Then she looked at the window and the January dark beyond it and the first snow coming down steadily and without drama, the way Vermont snow came as if it had always been the plan. She said, "Dennis Holt was my best friend for 20 years. He waited." She said, "We used to study together in a diner in Somerville. I've been trying to work out what I missed, what I should have seen. And I haven't been able to find it, which is worse than finding it, because it means there was nothing to see. He was just, he was just someone I trusted, and he decided that was an opportunity, and I can't make that make sense no matter how many times I turn it over." She said it the way certain things got said when they had been held for too long, not with drama, just with the flatness of a fact that had worn its edges down. The voice of someone who had said it to themselves in the dark so many times that saying it out loud was not different, just louder. He said, "You didn't miss anything. Some people are very good at being trusted." She said, "I should have." He said, "No, the failure was his, entirely his." She looked at him. He held her gaze. He said, "You built the company. You built it from nothing, twice as far as you'd expected, and it was real and it was good and it mattered to the people it served." He took from it. "That doesn't make it not real." She said nothing for a long time. He said, "I know you know this. I know you know it in the part of you that does the spreadsheets and the asset inventories and the planning. I'm saying it because sometimes knowing it and hearing it are different things." She was looking at the table. Then she looked up. She said, "My mother used to say that some losses stripped the room down to what was actually there." She was talking about grief, specifically my father leaving when I was 8. But she meant it generally. She said the loss was bad and the stripping was sometimes not, he said. She sounds like someone worth listening to, she said. She was. She said a lot of things I didn't want to hear at the time. She looked at the plan on the table, then she looked at the snow outside, then she looked at him, she said. I'll submit the plan to the attorneys. He said, all right. She said, Ward. He waited. She said, thank you. And then before he could say anything, I know you're going to say you were just doing the work. Don't. He almost smiled. He said, good night, Claire, she said, good night. He went to the sitting room and gathered Pearl, who woke up halfway and said, are we going, without opening her eyes, and he said yes, and she folded herself against his shoulder and was asleep again before they reached the truck. He drove home in the snow, which had thickened, and the road was white, and the Vermont landscape in January was the most complete winter he'd ever seen, full and silent and without apology. He thought about Claire's hands flat on the table. He thought about the plan she would submit and the court date that was coming. He thought about Dennis Holt in a Somerville diner at 2 in the morning, studying with someone who trusted him. He thought about what it cost a person to trust completely and what it cost when that trust was used. He thought about Rebecca, who had trusted him completely. He thought about being 20 minutes late. He thought, there are things that are your fault and things that are not, and sometimes getting them confused is the whole problem. He drove the rest of the way home in the good silence of a truck in a January snowstorm, with Pearl asleep against his shoulder, and the road clear enough to navigate and the property somewhere behind him, holding its snow. The hearing was on a Thursday. Ward did not go. He was not a party to the proceedings. He spent the morning in the barn, working on the evaporator's firebox door, which required a specific piece of cast iron he'd sourced from a salvage operation in Burlington. It fit. It was satisfying in the specific way that things fitting were satisfying, not dramatically, just correctly. Pearl was at school. The barn was quiet except for the sounds of the work and the wind outside and the particular silence of a large old structure that was used to holding weather. Old buildings had that, a quality of having stood through enough seasons that one more didn't alter them. Ward found it useful, working in a space like that. It had the same quality as useful silence in a conversation. It held what was put into it without adding anything. Claire had driven to Burlington early. She had been at the table when he arrived at 8, already dressed, already packed, with a folder of documents that she was reviewing one more time with the systematic attention she brought to anything that mattered. She had looked up when he came in through the mudroom and she had said, Ward, just his name. He had said, yes. She had looked at the documents and then at him, and then she said, I'll let you know. He had said, I'll be here. She had left. He worked through the morning, the firebox door, a section of the barn's internal framing that had gone soft near the foundation, the organizing he'd been doing of the equipment for the maple season, which was now 6 weeks away. He told Pearl that morning, dropping her at school, that they might hear good news today. Pearl had said she would hope for it. Then she had said, what does the good news look like? He had thought about this. He had said, it means the property stays, it means the house stays, it means Claire can keep doing what she's doing. Pearl had said, is Claire scared? He had said, I think she's tired of being scared. There's a difference. Pearl had accepted this with her characteristic seriousness and gotten out of the truck and run into school without looking back, which was how Pearl did everything that was resolved. He worked through the morning and into the afternoon. The January light was short and gray, and the barn held it. He thought about Claire in a courtroom in Burlington presenting a case for something that should not have needed a case. The property was hers. Her mother had left it to her. The fact that Miriam Fell had found a legal mechanism to contest this said nothing about the rightness of the outcome and everything about what money could buy in the way of delay. He thought about the use plan, about the photographs he'd taken and the equipment assessments and the comparative data and the 10-year projection. He had built the most credible document he knew how to build. He had done it because the property deserved it, and because he was good at it, and because Claire Ashworth was not someone who asked for help, which meant the help needed to already be there when she was ready to use it. He got a text at 2:15 in the afternoon. It said, motion denied. Attorneys say Miriam's case lacks foundation. Coming back. He sat in the barn with the text for a moment. The barn was quiet around him, the January cold outside, the piece of iron in his hands from the firebox door fitting where it needed to fit. He typed, "Good." She replied with nothing for several minutes. Then the plan helped. The attorney said the documented income strategy was the strongest element. He typed, "I'm glad." She replied, "I'll be home by 4." He went back to the firebox door. He was setting the barn in order for the end of the day when he heard tires on the gravel. He had been half expecting it, half not. The sound of a car on the gravel road had a different quality when someone was coming back rather than arriving for the first time, something about the pace of it, the certainty. He came out of the barn. Claire's car was in the usual spot. She was getting out. She looked the way people looked when something had been resolved, not triumphant, just relieved in a contained, private way. Like a muscle that had been held tight for a long time was allowed to stop. Not dramatically, just stop. She looked at him across the winter pale yard. He said, "I'm glad." She said, "I know." The January afternoon was going toward 4 o'clock, the light already low and gold, the snow from 2 weeks ago still on the ground, crusted and clean. The property was exactly what it was: 12 acres of Vermont winter, a barn, a house with good bones, a stone wall, a gate at the back. She said, "I have something to show you." He followed her around the side of the house to the cedar gate. She had a key in her hand, not new, worn, the kind of key that had lived in a pocket for months. He hadn't known she'd been carrying it. He looked at her face as she put it in the padlock, and what he saw was deliberate, not impulsive, not a gesture. A decision that had been made before this moment and was now being enacted. The padlock opened. She held it for a moment. Then she set it on top of the stone wall beside the gate, set it down carefully like she was putting it somewhere it could stay. She pushed the gate open. It moved without sound. The hinges Ward had oiled in October turned freely, and the gate swung out onto the path, and the path was covered in snow, and the beech trees on both sides had their bare winter branches against the low light, and the whole back of the property opened up beyond it. He stood beside her looking at the open gate. He said, "It's a good gate." She said, "It's a very good gate." Something in her voice was different, and he noticed it but did not remark on it because some things were worth giving room. And then Pearl came around the corner of the house. His mother's car was on the gravel, his mother standing beside it, and Pearl was running the way Pearl ran when there was open space and a reason, flat out, with her arms at her sides and her backpack bouncing and her breath visible in the cold air. She ran the length of the property and through the open gate and along the path in the snow and stopped when she reached Ward, and she hit him at the waist the way she had been hitting him at the waist since she was 3, the same running impact, the same certainty that he would be there and would catch her, and he did. He always did. Claire was standing at the gate. Pearl's head came up from Ward's coat and she looked at Claire. Pearl said, catching her breath, "Is the gate open?" Claire said, "Yes." Pearl looked at the gate, at the padlock sitting on top of the stone wall, at the path through the snow, at the beech trees, with the focused attention she brought to things that had been promised and were now arriving. She said, "Good." She turned back to her father and started telling him about something that had happened at school, the Foursquare dispute that was apparently ongoing and complex, and involved a question of whether the line was inside or outside, and whether the consensus of 6 players outweighed the objection of 2. She told it with great seriousness. Ward listened with his hand on her back. Claire stood at the gate, and then she came to stand beside them, and the 3 of them stood in the open gate in the January afternoon, and Pearl's narration of the Foursquare dispute continued with all its detail, and Ward caught Claire's eye once over Pearl's head. What he saw in her face was not nothing. It was closer to the beginning of something than to the end of anything. He looked back at Pearl. He said, "Who had the deciding vote?" Pearl said, "We voted." He said, "And?" Pearl said, 8-2 for inbounds, but Tobias still says it was out. I think he's wrong, but I understand why he thinks it. Claire said quietly, "Why do you understand why he thinks it?" Pearl looked at her. She said, "Because from where he was standing the line was closer to him. The angle makes it look different." Claire was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's a sophisticated piece of reasoning for a Foursquare dispute." Pearl shrugged. She said, "Perspective matters." She went back to talking about the game, but Ward saw Claire look at him again. Her expression was something between surprised and not surprised, which was the expression Claire had more and more often around Pearl. the expression of someone encountering a thing they had not known to expect. He drove Pearl home in the January dark, and the gate was open behind them as they left. It stayed open. The maple season started in late February. The sap ran for 3 weeks, the temperature cycling the way it needed to below freezing at night, above it in the day, the trees responding to the rhythm they had always responded to. Ward and Pearl were at the property on the collection days. Claire was there too, learning the work. She was not someone who observed without participating, which Ward had understood from the beginning, and which was one of the things about her that was, in the word he kept coming back to, worth staying for. Pearl ran the collection route on the east side of the sugar bush, which she had decided was her route, and which she managed with a clipboard and a systematic notation system she'd invented to track each tree's daily yield. This was not actually necessary for a first-year operation at this scale. It was absolutely necessary to Pearl. Claire ran the west route. She was learning the trees, which ones ran early and which ones ran late, which ones had the most sugar content based on the taste of the sap, which ones were older than the others by the width of their trunks. She learned them with the systematic attention she brought to any information she had decided was important, which Ward was coming to understand was her relationship to most information. She did not learn things passively. The evaporator was running by the third day of the season. Ward had set it up the week before, and when he got the fire going and the sap started moving through the pans, the smell of it, sweet and vegetal and somehow clarifying, the way the smell of reduction always clarified things, filled the barn and came out through the open door into the cold February air. Claire came to the barn door at mid-afternoon. She stood in the door with her collection bucket and looked at the setup. She said, "This is real." He said, "Yes." She said, "I was afraid it was going to be a project. A thing that took work to maintain the appearance of." He said, "It's a working sugar bush. It's been producing the whole time it was untended. You can't stop it from being real." She came inside and watched the pans for a while. She said, "There's a letter from Dennis's attorneys." He waited. She said, "They're proposing a civil settlement. A portion of what he stole returned to me as partial restitution. It won't be everything, but it will be something." He said, "That's good." She said, "I keep trying to feel angrier about it than I do. About the settlement, about all of it. And mostly what I feel is just tired." He said, "Tired makes sense." She said, "I wanted the anger to be cleaner, like it would make the betrayal mean something it should mean." He said, "Some things don't have the meaning they should." She said, "Your wife." He said, "Yes." She looked at the pans. The sap was reducing, moving from watery to something closer to itself. The color deepening by degrees. He watched it change and thought about how reduction worked, not losing something but concentrating what was already there. He had always found this useful to think about. She said, "Rebecca." He said, "Yes." She said, "I would have liked to know her." He said, "She would have had opinions about this sugar bush." Claire said, "What kind of opinions?" He said, "She would have had thoughts about the ratio of birch to maple in the blend. She was precise about flavor. She would have stood in this door exactly the way you're standing, and she would have said the maple is running strong this week and we should pull some of the birch sap separately." Claire said, "That sounds like someone worth knowing." He said, "She was. She had a good mind. She liked to understand things from the inside out, not just what something was but why it was that way." Pearl got that. Claire said, "Pearl gets a lot from you." He said, "She gets some from both of us." A small silence, the fire in the evaporator. The February afternoon doing what February afternoons did in Vermont, going gray early, the light folding down before you were ready for it. She said, "I've been thinking about the settlement." He waited. She said, "I'm going to accept it. Not because it's adequate, it isn't, but because spending the next 2 years in civil litigation costs more than the settlement will recover. In time, in legal fees, in whatever part of my attention it takes to maintain that level of conflict." He said, "That's a reasonable calculation." She said, "It feels like giving up." He said, "It's ending something that doesn't deserve more of your time." She looked at him. Then she looked at the pans. She said, "My father's name was Peter Ashworth. He left when I was 8. He left because, he said, the property was a burden and my mother refused to sell it, and the choice between staying married and keeping the property was one she'd made without consulting him." He said it like that was a reasonable thing to say. He waited. She said, "My mother's name was Frances. She did not consider it a difficult choice. She spent the next 30 years on this property, and I spent the next 30 years trying to understand why. I thought for a long time that the property was just stubbornness, that she was holding on to something that should have been let go, she said, and then she died, and I came back. And it's the first place in 2 years where I've felt like I was on ground that knew me. He said nothing. She said, I think I understand her now, he said. Some things take the right distance. She said, yes. She looked at the evaporator. She said, this is her barn. She used to tap those trees, not for production, just for herself. 40 gallons of syrup she would give away every year to anyone who wanted it. She thought that was a reasonable use of a property. He said, it is. She said, you think everything I do here is reasonable? He said, I think most of it is. I had some questions about the fence posts. She made a sound, not quite a laugh, closer, the shadow of one arriving before she was ready for it. She looked at the evaporator rather than at him, which was how she handled things that arrived unexpectedly. He said nothing. He let it land and stay. The barn was warm from the firebox. Outside, the February afternoon was going gray. Pearl could be heard on the east route, talking to herself or to the trees. Ward couldn't hear the words, just the cadence of her voice, which was the cadence of someone conducting a thorough inquiry. Claire said, not looking at him. What happens next? He said. In the season or in general? She said. In general, he said. In general, I think the cider press will be running by the fall if we get the orchard pruned this month. I think the kitchen garden subscription operation could be running by June if we get the starts going. I think you have a functional estate that generates documented income and is a legitimate concern. She said, that's not what I was asking. He said, I know. She looked at him then. The direct look that was one of the truest things about her. She did not look sideways at difficult things, she looked at them. He had known this about her since October, since the first morning on the porch. He said, I think we should go slowly. She said, I don't know how to go slowly. He said, I know, I'll be patient. She said, you're already patient. That's the thing I can't quite. She stopped. She said, you've been showing up here every day for 4 months, even when you weren't paid to. Even when I was, I know how I've been. He said, you were managing something real. She said, I was a wall. He said, yes. She said, and you kept showing up. He said, Pearl left her jacket. She said, Ward. He said, yes. She said, I don't know what I am yet. I'm still working that out. The property, the settlement, who I am in the next part of my life. I don't know all of it yet, he said. You don't need to know all of it, she said. But I think I'd like you to keep showing up while I figure it out. He said, I'll keep showing up. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, I should go see what Pearl is doing to that east root, he said. She's taking notes on each individual tree. She said, of course she is. She went out through the barn door. He heard her on the path, her footsteps on the packed snow, and then Pearl's voice, louder now, explaining something, and then Claire's voice, quieter, asking a question. Ward stayed with the evaporator and listened to the fire and let the good thing he was feeling be what it was, which was not dramatic, which was just steady and real and his. The gate had been open for 2 months. Neither of them had mentioned it again. It just was. It swung freely. The hinges moved without sound, and the path through it led to the stream and the orchard and the stands of birch at the back of the property. Pearl used it every time she came. She used it the way children use things they had decided belonged to them, which was completely and without ceremony. Ward used it to check the far end of the fence line. Claire used it on the morning she walked to the orchard, which she had started doing in early March, going out in the cold early light to stand among the apple trees and look at the pruning cuts Ward had made through the winter, the places where the new growth would come from. He had watched her do this once from a distance. He had not interrupted. He thought about Rebecca, who had taught him that some things were worth standing and watching. He thought about Pearl, who had walked through the gate before anyone had decided to open it, in a drawing in a notebook, which was how Pearl often found things before they arrived. He stood in the cold of the March morning and let all of it be what it was. The sugar bush produced 42 gallons of syrup in the first season, not remarkable for an established operation, remarkable for a property that had been untended a year before. Claire had the bottles labeled and ready by the end of March. She had spent 2 evenings on the label design, and what she produced was simple and spare. The name of the property, the year, the words Vermont maple in a clean serif type. Nothing more than it needed to be. Ward thought this was exactly right. A label that said what it was and did not try to be more. He had photographed every stage of the production. The taps going in, the collection runs, the evaporator firing, the syrup going into bottles. The photographs were in the documentation file for the attorneys, and also, though he hadn't said this to Claire, because they were worth keeping. The kitchen garden subscription had its first 12 households signed up by the 1st of May. Pearl had made the flyers at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in April, working with the focused deliberateness she brought to things she considered important. The flyers were good, not polished in a way that looked produced, but clear and real, with a drawing of the gate at the top that she had traced from her notebook. Ward had looked at the drawing on the flyer and then at Pearl and not said anything about it. Claire had not said anything about it either, but she had taken one of the extra flyers and put it on the kitchen windowsill, next to the field guide to Vermont trees. The orchard's first pruning was done before the ground softened in March. Ward had worked through a week of cold mornings with the loppers and the pruning saw, making the cuts that would direct the new growth, opening the canopy to light, removing the crossing branches that had been pulling the trees in wrong directions. It was methodical work, and it required a certain kind of seeing, not what the tree was now but what it was trying to become. He had always been good at this. It was what engineering had trained in him, and what working with his hands had developed further. Claire had come out on the second day to watch him work. She had watched for 20 minutes without speaking. Then she had said, "How do you know where to cut?" He had said, "You look at where the energy is going. Then you remove what's pulling it the wrong direction." She had looked at the tree he was working on, she had said, "And you can see that," he had said, "after a while. It takes time to learn to see it." She had been quiet for a moment. Then she had gone back inside. He thought she might have been talking about more than the trees. He did not ask. By May, the apple trees were breaking dormancy at the tips of the pruned limbs, the buds swelling, the first small leaves coming out in the particular light green of new growth. It was visible, the response to the work. Something that had been going wrong for a long time redirecting itself toward the right. Ward stood at the edge of the orchard on a Tuesday morning in May and looked at the trees and thought, October to May. 7 months. He had arrived on a Monday morning in October with his tools and a truck that needed new shock absorbers and a daughter asleep in the passenger seat, and he had been told to do the work and not bother anyone. 4 groundskeepers before him had left. He had not. He did not have a clean answer for why, even now, when the answer should have been clearer. He had stayed because Pearl's jacket was here. He had stayed because the fence wasn't done. He had stayed because the gate deserved to swing freely and the orchard deserved to be pruned and the sugar bush deserved to run and the property deserved care. He had stayed because Claire Ashworth was not indifferent to any of it, even when she was trying to look like she was. He had stayed because the work was real and the property was worth it. He had stayed. He was still staying. That was the whole of it. Ward's mother drove up from Montpelier one Saturday in May, partly to visit and partly because she had been asking about the Ashworth property for months and wanted to see it herself. She was 61, still working as an office manager at an architectural firm, a woman who had particular opinions about everything and was usually right about most of them. She had raised Ward and his sister alone after their father left when Ward was 12, and she had done it with a calm, practical competence that Ward had tried to understand, and eventually stopped trying to understand and just recognized as who she was. Her name was Elaine. She had dark hair that was going gray in a way she had not resisted, and she drove her 12-year-old sedan with the confidence of someone who had never once thought about whether the car impressed anyone. She arrived at the property at 9:30 in the morning with a pan of baked goods she had made that morning and handed directly to Pearl, who received them with great seriousness and carried them to the kitchen like a person entrusted with something significant. Elaine walked the property. She looked at the stone wall, which was fully restored, and the fence, which was straight, and the barn, which was organized and clean. She looked at the kitchen garden. She said to Ward that the property had good bones. He said he knew. She said the woman, he said Claire. She said, does she know? He said she knows, she said, and he said we're going slowly. She looked at him with the expression she used when she had more to say and was deciding how much of it to say. She said, "She's been through something real." He said, "Yes." She said, "So have you?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Those are not the same thing." He said, "I know." She said, "But people who have been through real things sometimes recognize each other." He said, "Yes." She said, "Ward." He waited. She said, "Your wife is gone. She would not want you to hold yourself still on her behalf." He said, "I know." She said, "Then stop being so careful." He looked at her. She said, "Be as careful as you need to be, not more." He looked at the property. At the gate open. At Pearl, showing his mother the section of the orchard they had pruned, pointing to each tree's cuts with her clipboard. At the May green coming up everywhere, the maples leafed out now, the apple orchard showing the new growth at the tips of the pruned limbs. He said, "I'll try." His mother said, "Good." She took Pearl for ice cream in town that afternoon and Ward stayed to finish some work in the greenhouse, and at some point Claire came out and worked in the kitchen garden, and they were aware of each other across the property in the way they had come to be aware of each other, not intrusive, just present. The way two people were present when they had learned each other's rhythms and no longer needed to account for the other person's presence. It was just there, and it was comfortable, which was a word Ward would not have applied to Claire Ashworth in October and applied to her now without second thought. At the end of the afternoon, when the day was going gold and the green of the Vermont May was the particular green that Vermont invented every spring and used once and then changed, Claire came to the greenhouse door. She said, "Your mother seems wonderful." He said, "She has opinions about everything." She said, "She was asking Pearl about the gate." He said, "Pearl told her she drew it first." She said, "I heard." He looked at her. She said, "Ward." He said, "Yes." She said, "I have been thinking about what you said about going slowly." He said, "Yes." She said, "I think slow is right. I still don't know who I am in the next part of my life. I know the property. I know the work. The rest of it I'm still working out." He said, "That's all right." She said, "But I wanted you to know that I'm working it out, not away from toward." He said, "I understand." She said, "All right." He said, "All right." She went back to the garden. He stayed in the greenhouse for a while. He thought about the gate. He thought about Rebecca, and about the way some things ended and other things opened, not in replacement but in addition, the way the apple trees had grown new shoots from the pruning cuts, not replacing what had been there, just new growth at the edges of the old. He thought about Pearl and the drawing she had made, the figure walking through the gate that she had said she didn't know yet. He thought he was beginning to understand. He thought about the orchard, which would produce its first cider harvest in October, and about the sugar bush, which would run again next February, and about the gate that was open every morning when he arrived and would be open when he left. He was not in a hurry. He did not need to be. The truth about refusal, not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself, is that it looks from the outside like stubbornness, like persistence that has no particular reason to it. 4 groundskeepers walked off this property, and each of them had a reason that was not wrong. The work was real. The woman in the house was not interested in being managed. The terms were complicated. Ward Calloway showed up because the fence wasn't done, and because Pearl had left her jacket, and because the gate deserved to swing freely. These were not large reasons, but they were enough. That is what nobody tells you about the kind of presence that changes things. It almost never announces itself. It is not a rescue. It is not a grand gesture at a critical moment. It is a man who shows up on a Tuesday morning to fix a fence rail and does not leave when it would have been easier to leave, and who brings his daughter on Saturdays so she can draw gates and ask questions, and who does not require anything from the woman in the house other than the most basic functional exchange, and who builds a use plan for an agricultural estate because the problem is interesting and the property is worth saving. What Claire Ashworth had decided in the weeks following October was that she was done with people. This was not a true decision in the deepest sense. People who are done with people do not let groundskeepers argue about gate hinges, do not answer a 7-year-old's questions about soil memory, do not stand in barn doors watching evaporators with an expression that has everything in it. She was not done with people. She was done with being hurt by them, which is different, and the difference is exactly the wall. Ward did not break the wall. He did not find the weak point and press it. He simply stood on the other side of it and did the work, day after day, and let it be what it was. And eventually the wall was not in the same place it had been, because walls do not hold still when someone refuses to acknowledge them. Pearl did not know she was doing this. She was drawing what she saw and asking what she wanted to know and falling asleep on drives and leaving her jacket places and running through open gates. This is the thing about children who have not yet learned to be careful about the things they offer. They don't portion it out. They give it in full. Claire Ashworth had known what it was to trust someone completely and to be wrong. She had spent 6 months sitting with the proof that complete trust was a thing that could be weaponized. She had locked the gate. She opened it in January in the cold with a key she'd been carrying all along. This is not a story about what money can build or what fraud can destroy or what courts can decide. It is a story about a gate that swung freely when the hinges were freed, and a woman who had kept it locked because she needed time to decide if there was something on the other side worth walking toward. There was. She is walking toward it. Ward is there. Pearl is already through the gate. The orchard is pruning itself back to something. The sugar bush is running. The kitchen garden is green. The stone wall holds, and the gate is open, which is what gates are for.